right here, but I'm not using it. I don't want to get too claustrophobic and, mess up my hair and all that kind of stuff. And so, yeah, gratuitous plug number one is obviously that I co-host, a podcast called The Neutral Cider Hotel with the lovely Martin Goodwin-Sharman, who's in the audience here and was on my fantastic keg sales and marketing panel earlier on, and the wonderful Grant Hutchison up in Scotland, who is thoroughly busy at the moment because he is just opening up his shop called Able, A-E-B-L-E, which is Danish for Apple, obviously. And of course, he is the man who is behind Restalk, fantastic cider importer and distributor. Go check it out. And plug number two is my old book. This is one of the last opportunities I'm going to be able to plug it very soon. All focus on the matter in hand today, which is modern British cider. Anyway, Felix, you're Michael Parkinson, you are Graham Norton for today. The floor is yours.
I know, this must be a strange role reversal for you, I suppose, being the one asked questions as it goes. So I was going to obviously focus on this question of modern British cider, less so on how's the book shaping up. I think if we just talk about it and then look forward to, reading. But I thought it'd be interesting to take a bit of a sideways look. So there's three things I'm going to ask about, and I'm sure between the two of us, we can massively easily fill an hour that way. And they all kind of center around a bit of contrast. I always think contrast can be quite illuminating to, define and know something. So the first one I want to ask a little about is your sort of past and your journey in cider, because I think no one has got quite the view in a global sense, in a breadth in terms of different styles and making of different forms. And I think in some ways your personal story is very much sort of reflective of some of the changes that have been going on in cider. And then that's the sort of past. And then we'll move to the present, which I think if we look briefly at what's going on in other places in the world to see what's similar or different in British cider, and British kind of modern British cider's place in the world in a wider sense. And then last of all, we'll move to the future and talk a little about the problems and the issues you think exist, because again, I think the challenges that are there can be quite reflective of where things are currently at. So maybe you'd like to rattle off some thoughts, first of all, from how cider has shifted from your very first engagement with it. It's the last few years, the pace, I'm sure, has been a different thing, the rate of change. But in that wider view, how is there certain things that stood out to you?
Yeah, and if anyone's got any questions anytime, please do put it in the Q&A. So for anybody who doesn't know, I'm from a little village called Dimmock, which is a lovely little classic quintessential English village on the Gloucestershire-Herefordshire border. And luckily for me, absolutely smack bang in the middle of sort of old cider and perry country, but a few miles from Mayhill and all that kind of jazz. And I didn't know any of this, of course, whilst really growing up, other than Weston's was in the village next door. And I knew that my uncle enjoyed cider. And he bought my brothers a flagon of Old Rosie one Christmas. And I had a few surreptitious swigs of that and quite enjoyed the flavor profile, which of a fairly dry, acid, meaty kind of scrumpy cider obviously boded well for the future. Cider was my drink of choice as a teen. Interestingly, I sort of unlike most people, I did it on beer and actually sort of really supped and savoured the cider, which is quite interesting. And my favourite ciders in that journey were Blackthorn, Dry Blackthorn, and Old English and Scrumpy Jack, which are the more kind of tannic driven of the mainstream ciders. And then it was a case of wanting to, then it was exploring the Weston's range of cider. This is nigh on 20 years ago, and they were great producers. I think in many ways a great producer today, but the ciders they were making were just sensational. And for anyone who remembers that organic vintage that they had, it is just mind-blowing, absolutely fantastic. The best cider you could get in the supermarkets, easily. And so enjoyed that, but then wanted to try and find, what was next? What's the next step? And
what led you to want to find the next step? Was it just that you liked some of the things you'd Well, I mean, it's refreshing, first of all, I have to say, to hear someone say, I had a bad experience on beer when I was younger, so I don't like it much.
Yeah.
So I often hear the opposite, it being cider. But in terms of that, what was the real kind of kernel that, was it the drinks themselves? Was it that locality?
For me, it's very much about, I'm very lucky that I have a very strong sense of place of where I'm from. If any of you were lucky enough to grow up in such a beautiful little village, then hopefully you would have something too. So I feel very strongly rooted in many ways and associated, even though I don't live in that village anymore, a real strong identity and sense of place. And it's quite sort of tingling almost. And that's not just from the cider. And so, you know, I'm a geography graduate. I've always enjoyed landscape and wildlife and local history. It was my granny, dear old Granny Joyce, who got a plug on Country File the other week. Go Granny. It was she who took me on these sort of walks across the countryside, and she knew everything, and she imbued me with this passion. And I kind of worked out that cider slotted right in the middle of that, bringing together obviously something fun by way of booze, but the people, the traditions, the culture, the fruit, the orchards, and the wildlife. It just like, I want to try and have a look at that. And so me and my brother one summer, I think it would be 2002, so we're nearly 20 years, got the Herefordshire Cider Route leaflet and saw that on the map that the closest one to Dimmock was Broom Farm, the Ross and Wise Cider and Perry Company. And so we're driving along, and then we turn off down the lane, and suddenly it's like we're in the middle of, you know, Middle Earth, and Frodo's running across the road. It's like, where the flip are we? This is crazy. And there's a little sign that says, cider down the little lane, and it gets smaller, wing mirrors whacking on the hedge, and you go up the driveway, and we got to, there was a sign on a door leading like sort of underneath the house that said, "Pull string for cider." And then there was Julie, a bit of baler twine in her, so he gave it a yank and ding-a-ling-a-ling. And then Mike popped his head around the door, hello, and opened the door into the cellar, and it was like, oh, and just have this.
So remind me, roughly, what year was this again?
2002, like July 2002.
Wow, okay, so really, I guess what, sort of 2001 onwards, the Magners boom, wasn't it, I believe?
2006. This predates
really?
the
Nice. Okay, half a decade out. Yeah.
This was a delve. This is whilst I was still at university, and it was the experience is really, really vivid, which is just lush. I remember opening up and having a look and just seeing these barrels, giant, you know, flagstone floor, and Mike cheerily goes, "Here you go." Goes to one of the barrels. Have that. That's a dry cider, and the sip, the taste, and the sensation was like nothing I've ever had before. The flavors, the intensity, the mouthfeel, it was just like, wow, I like this. I want to know more about this. And it just sort of rolled from there, really, for the next few years.
So how do you view that kind of making now? Do you view it as an element that kept alive, things that have been going on for a longer time? Or, you know, again, when you look at makers like Ross and Y, Oliver's, Greg's Pit, you know, those ones who the 2-decade mark is, you know, they're past that. Do you view that as very much a sort of self-propelled own thing, or very much just a continuation of past kind of elements? You know, do they mark, you know, influenced by wonderful people like Gene Knoll as well, the start of a new thing that ties into this question of modern British cider, or a continuation?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I do actually cover it in the book. One of the sections is what are the key fundamental steps in the past that have shaped where we are kind of right now. And the 1980s is that period when, on the one hand, so many of the cider makers, the traditional, the farmhouse cider makers, were going. They were gone. Cider duty being reintroduced in 1976, even with the 7,000 litre duty exemption, and just the modernization of agriculture and of general life, those farmhouse cider makers going. And although some did still remain, a lot of them did kind of disappear, and lots of those sort of did just sort of go on. But what you also had at this time were a group of real revivalists, those people who were either from that area or had moved back or were new and sort of could see this culture and this heritage and this thing, and wanted to ensure, because they could see that it was going, to ensure that it wasn't, and to learn and to try and champion. And the likes of, you know, Gene Knoll, you've mentioned there from Herefordshire was kind of really key and fundamental in that. Julian Templey down in Somerset from the cider point of view. Then, of course, in terms of upholding the mystique of things with the cider brandy as well, was a really key individual. And so the progenitors of and the students of those kinds of people, the Tom Olivers, the Mike Johnsons up in the three counties, and the raft of Somerset and Devon cider makers who sort of came in their wake. There was this sort of bridge, a continuation in one hand, but also some new blood coming in. But really, I think still I would probably call themselves at that point, traditional or farmhouse. Those were the terms, because that's precisely what they're doing, making sort of traditional styles of cider on the farm.
Yeah, and obviously, so the counterpoint to that, the timings that overlap, as you say, if that really comes to correlation as the farmhouse side, and we'll move on to sort of more recent years shortly, but we mentioned, Magners, you talked about various Westerns things, for example. How, and obviously that started, the real kickoff in that in 2006. The other big question, of course, I guess, is where do you think all of that ties into this question of modern British cider? That was that massive resurgence that put this sort of, over-ice cider, but cider in a form on the minds and aware, to so many people in a new form. How do you feel that sort of ties into what now is possible for those, earlier traditional kind of makers, the Rotsmeyer, the Olivers, etc., and just in the wider scheme of things, because it's not like cider's recent history hasn't been moving all over the place, really, with entirely different scales. Yeah,
I think that the Magners effect was and is absolutely fundamental to where cider sits now, and the fact that we are here undertaking a admittedly online rather than in person, sort of trade show, and that we've got the amazing people and producers that we do, a considerable proportion is rooted in, regardless of what you think about Magners as a cider, it doesn't matter, in my humble opinion. What it did do was to change a mindset and opinion for a considerable number of drinkers, including maybe like a generation, that cider maybe was something that was fun, enjoyable, youthful, vibrant, celebrated for men and women, which did so much to detract from 20 years. Like the 90s were a pretty dark time for the cider, for cider in the broader public consciousness, to be fair. So it's provided a platform like, yes, cider is something that's worth interesting and worth investigating. And of course, the primary benefits were the big boys, and they massively increased their volume. But they dragged up those pre-existing smaller producers to make them grow. And if you have a look at the numbers and the data from something like, in the fantastic cider manual here from Larry Nelson, the number of cider makers that are in that and that we could think of, the number of them that started after 2006 is huge. So it really was an essential catalyst for making cider like, okay, this is something worth investing in, worth investigating, and let's get this show on the road.
Yeah, and it does raise that fascinating question. I always, when people ask on, perry and cider, one of the key kind of differences that you often hear is that so few people relatively know of perry relative to cider, and that fundamentally, in this question of what is modern British cider, is what's that base level? What do most people in the public think it is? You might be telling them various new things in your book, but at the same time, it's sort of, that's a really important thing to know. And that is so hugely what's defined that in so many people's consciousness, this sort of boundary between elements of farm gate stuff, holiday elements as well, be it like sort of northern France, Cornwall, Devon, etc. But through to that real definition of what most people in the public think of as cider, let alone the wider things it's kind of facilitated and likely allowed, because people are aware of cider, and you can give them something else that, as you say, might be something else from their taste buds and fascinating. Perry's a bit more of a clean slate, which is good, but also has its challenges depending on, various kind of factors. So, yeah, so I guess turning then to the more recent few years, obviously things have moved for you from working with various players, like on the big scale end, you've had an insight into that, like few people who, and then you also, in working as a ciderologist, you're able to work with such a broad array of makers in the UK and internationally. I guess if you were to try and highlight, say just 3 things that have been the real points of change you've seen, felt in the last sort of 3 or so years, is there anything that jumps to mind?
So much. So my cider journey was then to go and work for Ross on Wye. Lived in the shed in the garden and helped Mike for a year and just understood basic principles and sensory and taste and that just wonderful minimal intervention type of cider making, to then go and work for Weston's, where I was working with 200,000 litre tanks and massive sort of logistical challenges of just trying to move cider around and chaptalizing and diluting and understanding what and how and when, to then go and work for Bulmers, for Heineken, the biggest of all. Not as a cider maker, I was starting my journey of talking about it by this point. And what I observed is again, because I'm not a maker and because I don't necessarily have a fundamentalist attitude towards cider, is that I endeavor to try and see the good that all these producers can do. So as far as the world's largest cider maker is, they've got circa 10,000 acres worth of sort of orchards within Herefordshire and around, supporting that rural economy and all those kinds of things. And yes, there are sort of challenges and issues when it comes from a market dynamic. And it just made me understand that I just really enjoy cider in its entirety, and that's then sort of translated through into the Ciderologist. And I started it maybe 9 or 4 years ago now. We're approaching the 4th birthday, because I could sort of just see and feel that maybe now was just about the right time when maybe I could go out on my own as an independent voice and advert to try and go, yay, cider, because, most people go cider, or cider, yeah, and so.
It's also, I guess it's kind of easy, for a lot of people new to this, or nowadays, it might seem quite natural and evident that that's possible. But as you say, those few years ago, it was a bit of a different question. I'm sure it had its trepidations for you. I even remember back to the first maybe 2 years of running my business. Yeah, there was still that element in my head where I was like, is there just some, you try and contextualize, is there a reason why people don't know about a lot of this cider? Is there something that just like 1 in 1,000 people have some allergy to that they used to sort of, that's why it never kicked off previously? Is there some basis, something you're missing that is the like the block in the Jenga tower or something, and actually through the process you learn a lot more about actually how things are not always logical in the world. It's quite a thing when you look at the hindsight. Just say we've got a couple of questions coming in, but I think we'll turn to questions towards the end. We'll try and scroll through and get everything, but do put them in the Q&A section if you can, just to hopefully avoid us missing anything. I mean, one thing I mean, just
going back to that to your point that you were asking, was that I came back to the UK in 2016. I've been living in New Zealand for 3 years, and I came back and suddenly I spoke to Tom Oliver, and he said, there's this guy Felix he's got my cider in London. It's pretty cool. Nice. There's Alice Churchwood. She's distributing my bag and box cider in London. Oh, that's pretty cool. Yeah. There's this guy Martin down at a bottle shop in London. He's a bit out there, but he's mad passionate about cider. But there weren't huge numbers of cider advocates, in that professional kind of capacity, where it was incumbent upon them as their jobs to be knowledgeable and passionate and advocating cider. And to have a crack at it was something that I wanted to do. I had nothing to lose. I had a life position, no kids, no mortgage. It was like, I'm just going to do it and try it. And if it doesn't work out, no worries. At least I can say that I was the ciderologist for a little bit. And the fact that I am still able to do this, even with the challenges of the last 12 months, is testament to those amazing and incredible changes that have happened in the last 3 years. If you want me to give you a visual demonstration of that, have a look at these. All these products are things that did not exist in my kind of like sphere of influence that far away. So we're talking about canned cider. We're talking about ciders.
This didn't exist 3 months ago.
Advocating apples, Perry in a can, unfiltered, incredible 750 ml sharing bottles with really bold, cool, funky design. I think that I could feel that something was bubbling up, and cider makers have delivered on that, and it's just trying to change that inertia. So now that the products are there, the opportunity for the trade and the consumer to see them begins, and once they see it and taste it, they demand it, and that means it's far more likely that it will get stocked, and with that positive side for us.
Fascinating, that kind of momentum, as you say. I noticed this. Al as well, she definitely noticed it, that there are capabilities in terms of how much a bottle might cost because of the technique being more complex, things that just can sell and get through as it would have done, that sort of self-propelling momentum. So much of what we've always done has been this sort of proof of concept thing. And, that kind of goes on with various things we've got planned and such, like just to really prove to people what this cider, can do. And in the early days for us, yes, that was really trying to up the level at every stage of the kind of restaurants we supplied, because they're that real kind of arbiters of taste, the gatekeepers saying, yes, this is really good. And that's just such great proof. That's the kind of early adopters, But I remember, as you say, the early days, Al and I every now and then would meet and have coffee, and it really felt like we're the only two people even trying to do that, sell that kind of stuff. And it felt like London was the only place maybe then that we could really have a go at that. And we'd try to kind of share notes, and such like. And, it does, in the wider thing of modern British cider, then, that pace of change and the things that have shifted, it does bring up an interesting question, I think, of, does it feel a strange time? In some ways, to me, it feels a very pertinent time to be writing a book on modern British cider. Does it also feel strange? Because it's such a time of flux, And again, one question I'm less aware to, what the answer might be is, of the big cider makers out there, given this past year, how is their kind of cider and their industry shifting, changing, going to have been changed ultimately? Because that's also got to be a seismic shift in a big section of what is modern British cider. Is that one you have, from your experience, clearer thoughts about?
Yeah, so just on the first part, it makes it very challenging to write a book right now. I will say that. If I was writing this 3 years ago, it would have been considerably easier. And also not just because of COVID, but also, as boring as it is, but as fundamental as it is, tax duty does have an impact disproportionately almost over the cider world relative to other drinks. And there is this big alcohol duty review happening right now. I hope that it's covered in the session later on today. Because any sort of significant changes in there might have an impact upon what and how cider makers do or grow and things like that. So it's a bit challenging from a book writing point of view, but from a general book advocacy and ciderologist point of view, this is the most exciting time for cider that I've ever experienced. It's amazing. I'm so excited. Having the opportunity to reach out to different cider makers. There are loads of cider makers that I've spoken to who I hadn't spoken to before, either because I literally didn't know they existed, or maybe they've just sort of increased their sort of communication or advocacy, or just that the liquids have improved possibly. It is just the most exciting time, I think, from this smaller end of the spectrum, let's say. And I think that, a chunk of that is a little bit of the craft beer effect latently kind of coming in, these curious consumers. Rachel Hendry from the Beer Collective talks about this compound drinking, people who they're not just a beer drinker or a wine drinker or the cider drinker, they're interested in interesting drinks generally. And so there's
almost drinking or such, like it's more based on the nature of the properties, it almost goes back to the point you made very early on, like the connection with Dimmock, that sense of, like provenance, terroir, the sort of located in a place. It was a huge factor for me. Herefordshire was the foundation to it all, I think creating in a place that there's that prominence of orchards, there's the sense of history to that. There's so many layers to appreciate and enjoy. And as you say, it's such a fascinating time. The way I view it, and I'm interested to get your thoughts on this, is, again, it's a bit the like proof of concept kind of side. There's a stage that's been reached. There's like the first step that we're on to now, where it's sort of moved, and it connects to the compound drinking thing, from being the sort of cider bubble who are just cider people to we really sort of have a presence now in this wider sort of good quality drinks bubble of, with natural wine and craft beer and other stuff, thrown in there, people who really engage with them at a certain level, not the really casual odd pale ale, pub kind of beer drinker, for example. And you said the opportunity is the thing that feels like it's there. The conversations I have a lot with makers and such like is now's the chance that we can make it actually real. The possibility is proven. The big question is a lot of practical, logistical stuff. You say stuff like tax is really how does it actually shape up now that the possibility is proven and it's the chance to achieve it actually end up like, how does it actually shape, you know? So maybe it's a question of the challenges to that.
Yeah. Well, I think, you know, so we're in this space where there are a large number of consumers who are maybe a little more open than ever to trying new drinks, and that might be new to them. Cider obviously isn't a new drink. It's one that's, you know, so loaded with preconception and thought. So you've got people who are definitely more sort of curious and into their drinks. And, you know, one of the maybe weird, unintended or unexpected consequences of COVID-19 has been the enforced exploration of drinks via online platforms, and whether actually seeking them or kind of just coming across interesting ciders that looked a bit different from what they've ever had and just giving it a go. What's there to lose? Or to maybe having
small luxuries is a really big one that you say, because all of a sudden, if you're buying retail in that sense because you have to, you can get things that otherwise you might not come across in certain senses, or what you can get for your money. I've had this sort of feeling it's been a really big factor for us that there's something at a difficult time in a difficult year, something wonderfully optimistic about discovering something new and fascinating with lots of wonderful values and properties to it. That's a great experience across a difficult year for someone to have. And also it's that sort of not necessarily downgrading of luxuries, but we definitely had a lot of customers who, you know, really love their wine, but they suddenly realize with this kind of cider, you can get a hell of a lot more for your money, but still so many of the kind of properties there. If someone is
Absolutely
cautious for actually, yeah.
What I think is really important as well is that because of the experiences of type of industry that I've worked in, I'm a fan of all cider. I'm a fan of good cider for different consumers and different occasions. And into that will be kegged cider, will be ciders going into supermarkets. You know, I'm a big fan and advocate of pulped, and they've just got into 529 Tesco stores across the country. That has to be an amazing indication that a grocer is starting to see that there is something interesting around craft cider, smaller cider that isn't just from the six largest kind of cider makers.
And it wasn't that long ago, actually, that some of the big names in craft beer hit the supermarket shelves, really. In the scheme of things, it was pretty damn recent. So, as you say, it's a fascinating, you know, point to think on. Yeah,
absolutely. And that is going to be significant in getting the concept. You know, there are still, you know, more than 50% of people never drink cider. Ever, never. So, you know, there's quite a lot of people we still got to reach. And even of those people who do drink cider, the likelihood of them ever seeking or trying to find something that isn't their normal go-to is fine. So to have a bottle that looks something a little bit different and a bit interesting right on the supermarket shelf next to their normal might just change some decision making. And and the fact that this is happening right now again is just demonstrative of, and hopefully catalyzing this excitement and this driving this further.
So there's an interesting question. You mentioned, of course, bottle there. To what extent do you think there are innate elements within cider that just inherently will shape and form how things do, you know, what really the definition of modern British cider is 10 years down the line, which I believe slightly ties into a question we have. But because, you know, again, you look at something like wine, and yeah, you get the odd tiny little bits of small bottles of that, you know, on aeroplanes, but obviously not much at the moment at the supermarket. It's hard to ignore that there must be fundamental elements that I think factor in elements of how something is made, has to be made, the labor, the cost, or the economics, all of that kind of stuff that really shapes the outcome, that inherently that's a drink that comes in these large bottles. Cider has this strange, fascinating mix that, you know, we're so accustomed to it in the UK for that long time, being in, exactly. Like, does cider have an ability? Can it have an ability to exist in so many different formats? Or is there an inevitability that it'll end up having to settle mostly into a certain kind, in the way that beer is so often that pint setup, wine is so often that large bottle. Is it just a point of flux? Is it some magic thing with cider that the different kinds of cider that can be made can cross different boundaries like that? Or how do you view that? Is there something way to shape that, or is it varied enough?
Yeah, as I just demonstrated to you there, that range and that diversity of packaging and presentation and style is there. It's one of the cider's, I think, great attributes, and conversely, one of its great challenges is that there is this amazing diversity with it. Still carbonated, a natural in fermentation, whether it be served on draft as a keg or keg conditioned or bag in box, or whether it comes in a 330ml bottle, or whether it comes in a can or a 330ml or 440ml. There is this amazing diversity and range. Personally, for me, if there is a particular kind of style and elegance and aesthetic and time and place of consumption that makes somebody go, I want to buy that, it's all good with me. I think certainly for the next, cider is always a little bit kind of slow to the game. So the idea of putting a cider into a 330ml can, let alone a 440ml can, we've got to let that play out for the next 3 or 4 years to see whether that is good or bad. The 500ml bottle will always remain and will always kind of be there. The 750ml is here to stay because fantastic producers and, dare I say, fantastic distributors and merchants as well are showcasing.
Great, yeah.
There you go. That cider can perform that function of being with food, with sharing, with celebration. It's cider's amazing attribute that it can do so many different things. So I think we just have to put it all out there and push it.
Exactly. It becomes in the hands of fate, as it were, in the hands of the consumers and in the hands of the market in that way.
That's right.
I think that's a really big factor as well in terms of definitions and such like. Actually, what gets used in that wider context will be, a real kind of definer of it. It's still not even necessarily set the term that, to differentiate different kinds of cider or such like. But and as you say, there's also the interesting question of draft. Fundamentally, the way I look at it, say in craft beer, is initially you had mostly a lot of those small bottles. Then cans came in at this stage where people knew enough that you get a slightly better price in a can. Connotations of a can, well, it doesn't matter because people know that brewery and that liquid. They know that it's wonderful. So they get a little bit more value. Do we reach that stage, which then was the next kind of stage where craft beer really got flying on draft? Because again, the consumer can get that wonderful quality liquid at a better price. I still think there's a long way to go on that. I think knowing the market in terms of stuff like keg conditioned, the volumes that you need for the inherent wet trade with that, the demand at a stage, there's a long way to go before I think that can really fly. Because if you're a pub, you need to sell a certain amount through a line. You need enough people wanting it and knowing it to do that. Particularly if you've got quality liquid that means the costs of certain places. But it is the fascinating question. And I think your answer there is just have to see how it comes out is kind of exactly it, really.
Obviously, Felix, you were tuning into the keg session that I facilitated earlier on today, where there was a number of great discussions precisely around this. And one of the there are great liquids that are going into keg, whether they be keg conditioned or more classic kegging. I'm a fan and an advocate of both. Where we are now is that we've got those liquids. In fact, we've got the conversations and maybe even the ability for great ciders to be competitively priced. It's now trying to convince any GM in anywhere that it's worth sticking that on instead of another cider, or heaven forbid, maybe they dedicate 2 lines to cider because we've got a lovely, fresh, lean, minerally acid-driven cider providing one kind of flavor profile and a lovely, chewy, raw, bittersweet and the other. Cider and cider, but cider and cider. Yeah. To try and take off one of the 5 IPAs, wouldn't that be great? So again, but you have, in order to do that, you have to demonstrate that there is the volume and the demand. But how do you do that if you don't give it the opportunity? We're in that space still. So we're right on the front line right now, which fills me with excitement. And I'm allowed to do that because I'm not the one who's trying to pay their mortgage by trying to sell cider. I'm just talking about it, I think I've got the easy job. No risk.
Fascination. Why it's so lovely to see, as you say, like Grant's wonderful shop opening up in Scotland the other day. And there's various other things you hear of and various things you hear of in the works even, that for me feels like the stage now. It's the point of cider on its own two legs. It's not just can we get a bid in a craft beer shop, a natural wine bar, or whatever else. That's the next stage of proof of concept. And that's what broadens things, and doing it in its own right first, I think, is what can allow those things to broaden out. And that's the dream, in my mind, at least. If you can have that awareness and that demand that makers can both make wonderful quality things, but also at the kind of volumes they want to, that you get this sweet spot, that you can have incredible quality cider. You could have like a cider bar, but everything being cider, can be cheaper than wine can be blooming expensive. But you can get so much of those qualities and those properties. I do think there's this inherent sweet spot with cider and what it, like this usually slightly lower alcohol and yet the variety, the complexities. There's this really intriguing space it has yet to claim, but I think it really can occupy. Cliched as it might sound, in that sort of territory between wine and beer, it can really
absolutely. And what your sort of question was around, the future. I mean, and that's there's a lot, and we probably haven't got anywhere near enough time to do it. But the phrase, the ideology, and the ethos that I am now really kind of pumped up with is that cider is cider. And that is an amazing thing. Not like, cider's so self-deprecating. It's so flipping British. Yeah, hi, I'm cider. Don't tell anyone I'm cider. It's like, I'm cider. I'm proud. Wear a garish shirt and shout from the rooftops because this drink has got an older heritage. Industries and markets and nations and brands would kill for all of this. And the range of diversity. All across the UK, I've calculated that I'm going to feature cider makers from 38 different counties and the Isle of Wight, the Isle of Man and Guernsey, all the way up to northern Scotland, everywhere. This is the most amazing thing. And I utilize beer and wine as positions to which to try and talk about where cider is and cider sits. But I'm increasingly less wanting to talk about those other things and just say what cider is and isn't that amazing, and just try and advocate that to the hilt. And this surge of kind of energy and effort and people, and it's the advocates and the ancillary element as well as the producers themselves that has really grown in this last 18 months, and that is just really important.
Well, again, as you said, right with that, the growth of it, and again, the sort of transplant and seeing the first stages of journalists who mostly write about other stuff, writing odds and ends about cider, to again, cider as a focus, And as you say, I've got to say there are, just fascinating things going on in Scotland. Some of the makers coming out of the woodwork, such like, really, really intriguing. But to turn, I guess, let's turn to one of the questions which ties into the international side. Question from Maria Kennedy about the rising tide of cider revival in England relative to America, because that is a fascinating question. There's obviously a bit like America's approach to Spain as well. There's a lot of reverence from certain quarters, but equally the pace of things, the nature of things, be it a late night Uber at CiderCon where you're singing a bit of Elvis Presley in the mad I've ever been in, going across the bridge, in that mad spectacle and scale of something like CiderCon. But it is fascinating, is it been a one-way street? How do you think things have crossed over and interacted?
So there's lots of US folk who come to the UK and Europe in general to see the old orchards, to see the barrels, the trees, the varieties, the peri-pear avenues and the culture, and just to imbue it and to be inspired and just to love the majesty for it. But when they come over here, they kind of scratch their heads a little bit and go, well, it looks a bit rubbish, or it's really cheap, and like, where'd you buy it? And what's the crack? So there's a little bit of shock as to we've got all the heritage, but so much challenge in terms of how that translates to the marketplace. And that's precisely because we do have this heritage and a later, heritage and connotations of what cider is. The USA, on the other hand, although there is long-standing heritage, killed off for various kind of reasons, it's just sprung back to the fore precisely because it doesn't have that recent history, so it can kind of do what it wants to do, and that's pretty broad and diverse in flavor profile, style, and ideology, and just that USA attitude of like, go at it, market, brand, talk about it, invest, showcase, shout about it, make a story. The fact that there's 4 cider bars in Portland, which is basically more than the rest of the UK put together, although I take that back now that we've got this wonderful proliferation of tap rooms and spaces. But, you know, every city's got a cider bar. You can buy awesome cider in Whole Foods on pretty much any kind of street. So a tiniest element of some of that go-getting attitude is kind of starting to translate over. Certainly anybody who's been to CiderCon or to the US definitely brings back some kind of passion and energy.
Yeah, and you see then things obviously like little Pomona's set up, you know, you can see a lot of echoes of some American makers, joys of things like them having a tap room. I mean, one thing I find interesting as well is, you know, like when we're in California and you visit winemakers, same as, you know, New Zealand winemakers, which you're very familiar with, there's a real focus then on putting wine, you know, tasting at the winery, but also putting it with food in a very fine way. And it's going to be an interesting question to see how cider makers themselves develop and evolve over the next few years in their offering, you know, in terms of bringing people in, what they offer and show. You know, obviously the sort of taproom setup is very influenced by the craft beer, you know, arrangement and setup. To what extent, you know, what bits are picked and chosen, you know, for that. So other questions. We have one for you, which is Snog, Marry, Kill on Martin or Grant, your co-hosts. I don't think you have to answer that one.
All of the above. To all of them.
Asking about the Paris Saison, you know, and obviously Oliver's, who you worked on that with, does Mills collaborations, various other things. How do you see that side of stuff? I mean, the classic, I guess, is it brings people into the fold. Is it going to have its section in Modern British Cider as its own territory?
I think there will be mention to co-fermentation. I'm keen to try and cover as many things as possible, not just because they exist and because I think they are great exemplifications of sort of drinks and of some of the newer type of things that are happening. I'm not going to shout about them above classic West Country style cider or Kiev or more acid driven. It is just something that's there. The volume is tiny. Does that mean that we shouldn't talk about it? No, it should be included. And it's on the front edge of things that are fun and creative and playful. And certainly that La Saison des Poires, which is a blend of pear juice and a saison wort and fermented together, produced an amazing drink. And the iteration number 3, Mr. Oliver has undertaken with Johnny Bright from the Hereford Beer House, and I got the opportunity to have a little sneaky taste just last week, and you're not going to be disappointed, people. I'll tell you that. Coming soon. Dare I say, it might make an appearance at the Cider Salon in Bristol, Saturday the 14th of August.
Yeah.
Head cidersalon.co.uk for your tickets. If you're interested in interesting cider, it's the event.
It really will be, and especially after this past year, I think it's going to be a hell of an event. There's food this time. There's all sorts of wonderful things, you know, and there's plenty of space, isn't there? So, you know, come what may, it should be, you know, going all flags flying. So, which also, again, I love that idea that it's a snapshot in time is really what you're trying to capture, and then Modern British Cider 2 or more Modern British Cider or whatever it is. A few years down, it ties into another question about chapters to be added. We've got 2 more questions, a little bit more time, but I want to, before we move slightly onto the challenges again, any other bit, it is everything that you see as fascinating new prospects, areas for, you know, you think will be happening more. Obviously, there's, as you say, the supermarket shelf side, opening up of the sort of new wave of slightly larger medium-ish makers, I think is a really fascinating one. And I mean, this almost even goes back, I know I'm segueing again, to the US-UK thing, because I have a feeling, you know, UK is going to stride along a nice bit in the coming years. It's sort of 2 routes. You know, America's been very fast, but I think now is sort of it's got things to define and to entrench and make classic and make a part of daily life for people. Here, we sort of already had that. You know, we were starting, you know, not from afresh. We're trying to kind of shift that, but now things are really rolling. There is that sort of inherent previous traditions, elements, you know, that tie in wonderfully like wassail and such like. But yes, is there anything that's really caught your eye as you think that's going to happen more? That's interesting. That kind of element of making is really shaping up to be something fascinating in the next few years.
I mean, you're right. I think what is really important and I hope does happen, and duty changes might sort of be a part and facilitate that, is, as you said, this emergence of mid-scale producers making a really exceptional product that is accessible in flavor profile and of price point quite easily. At the moment, you've got about 360 producers here, about 6 up here, enough bugger all basically in that kind of mid space. USA, you have a much greater distribution, and there are various kind of reasons kind of for that. So I'm very excited about the growth of really awesome, mid-scale producers, and I would put sort of Sanford Orchards very much in a sort of driving role in that place, the ability to do all sorts of things. I really do think that also cider, great cider in kegs has, again, a fundamental part to play in that, because it is the way that so many cider consumers drink it. So they might trade up or trade across, whichever way, or for non-pre-existing, for beer drinkers who kind of like, every time they go into the bar now, there's this craft cider on there that's like, well, maybe I will give it a go. And they would give it a go if it was in an accessible kind of format. Maybe they would be less inclined if it came in a if it came in a 750ml bottle. It's just down to individual producer and occasion.
Well, that ties nicely into a wonderful question from Lucy, which covers that kind of point of people accessing cider. For me, I think, the big question for us now is, there's a momentum, which I think feeds through certain industry and drink, into wider craft beer, natural wine. I always tie it to this thing of kind of aura, the idea of the word spreading ahead of, the idea that someone's told you or mentioned or you've seen it, then you want to try. That's been the sort of thing, the critical for. And it is that very interesting question, how do you do that? Education gets batted about, but, again, I always use this anecdote of a friend I'm caught up with a couple of years ago, knew from school, who was the guy who used to, have cheap lagers at Wetherspoons because it was the best price. Might well still go there, but he has pale ales and IPAs. And he actually said this wonderful sort of thing about he can't have those cheap lagers anymore because they don't taste like anything to him. He doesn't have a knowledge and an education and awareness of craft beer. He might not go into, Wild Beer Co. stuff or, various other kind of makers. But that was a real taste bud shift. That's what it was, just from tasting it. I think obviously tasting is key, but that in itself opens questions. How do makers, especially if they're small, you're not giving, tons of stuff away. How do you make that happen? I think social interactions of friends and people is a huge part. And there's so much goodwill out there. We experience a lot of that in terms of people being in touch. But I also, that's the big question. And again, like Grant Cider Shop, we've got a plan in the work that will hopefully pan through, is this setup where people can have that first revelatory experience. Because we even get people getting in touch nowadays, and it's actually hard. We can recommend customers of ours, restaurants, shops and such like. But even then, at the moment you can't do samples, but even then it's still a bit of a hard question. Like, what's that? What's the best place or the list of places to go to where, as you say, like in the US, you can go to a cider bar, you can ask them at the bar, oh, I like this kind of stuff, what can I try? Where you can experience and go deeper properly, I feel, is a next kind of boundary. But what are your thoughts on it works?
I completely agree with you. And from lots of time that we spent together and kind of conversations and the nature of the type of people and products that you work with, it is about selling this amazing story and this aura and this concept and ideology of cider being this fantastic drink, of which I wholeheartedly support too. But I am a big fan and proponent of slightly more kind of classical education, and gratuitous plug number 12 or whatever it is. I run these cider training courses with the Beer and Cider Academy. I'm now doing them online. Head to craftynet.com and check out Cider Academy and sign up. And I've been doing some this week. And what I'm really, really incumbent to say is that I'm not seeking to define what every single cider is. No. What I am endeavoring to do is to give people the tiniest bit, the first stages of nuggets of knowledge and understanding of what does that taste like? What is it that you're tasting? Why does that happen? Simple as that, to enable people to become a bit more informed about, cider can taste like that or like that for this reason or this reason. And if we can give that, even that tiniest level and degree of knowledge and understanding.
It's not even telling people, as you say, what something is. It's saying, it's opening up the prospect that it's way more than they thought it was. It's that little kernel of possibility. And it, again, it's very much that. It's going beyond the sort of social construct that is the cider bubble, and it's pulling new people in. It's saying people in craft beer, natural wine, the properties and the things that you value and love about that, look, here they also exist. You might like this, And I mean, one thing I used to do technique-wise, I used to sell, lovely Trevor and Fergus at St. John let me sell cider from their railway arch, the bakery here in London years ago. In the early days of this, it was quite a long week, obviously, doing that on the weekends and running the business during the week. But that could be people buying bread at 11 in the morning. And I often, I might ask people if they've got any allergies, but I didn't tell them what I was giving them sometimes, little shot glass tasters, because people otherwise might well say, yes, I had a bad experience, or I don't like cider. And yet, if I just, without saying anything, gave them a little taster and moved on to other people, so often they'd be like, excuse me, what was that? So really, really fascinating in that way in terms of that right taste. I think you also have to really manage your audience, as it were. And another anecdote on this, I remember years and years ago, before I got into cider, even tasting a Wild Beer Co. creation, and I did not know what to expect or what to make of it. And I think, there are elements in cider that are fascinating, but might not be the starting point. Absolutely, So I think having that kind of awareness, being able to kind of ask someone what they like, read them, engage them, lead them on that path is a key factor. In the last little bit of time, let's turn to another question, if that's all right. We have a question saying about cider being pulled in so many directions, like cider is wine, cider is beer, cider is alcopops. I mean, notes about it being kind of cider not wanting to be pigeonholed. I personally view that as it's a testing. Cider's working out, trying different things, working out what fits. Different people trying to say, how do we get people to know this? Do you view that as a cider trying to avoid being pigeonholed? Do you feel it's being pulled in different directions? Do you think it's just the nature of cider, the different factors that it's going to have these all different, and do they become whole big sections of an industry of their own down the line, or does a couple prevail? How do you,
it's at this point, like I said, cider is in this place of people having past knowledge and understanding and perceptions of what cider is, and new people coming to it. It is in a state of flux. If somebody is doing something and providing a platform that is saying, this is a drink that is interesting, that is worth respecting, that is worth learning more about, that is a great choice for different occasions, and that you could have instead of a beer or wine, i.e. they're trying to positively advocate cider, I don't mind. So I'll tell you that I do not define what a modern British cider is in my book. Shock horror, exclusive. We're just not there yet. Even I am not so condescending as to say, actually, modern British cider is that. It's not that. It's a great example.
Are you willing to commit here and now, live, that will be the last line of your book? We're not there.
It's actually pretty much the first line in the book.
Oh, okay, it's all about it, yeah.
Because we're not there yet. It's like saying me writing the this is craft beer definitive in 2008. Well, hang on, all right, so the Colonel's out and so Brewdog's out, but who hasn't happened yet? What hasn't? New England IPA hasn't happened yet. Hang on, let's take our time. Let's just
a real desire for definition that people love. Yeah. I think it's sort of, as you say, it's sort of, the fascination is that it's in a state of flux, that there's these possibilities there. And actually seeing how it goes, it's sort of an update as to where things are at then, but as it seems all to human desire wanting to define things, and then that, either becomes redundant fairly quickly, or, and I get this like on food pairing. I'm never a fan of the kind of pairing where you talk about, say, umami and such like, because I don't think many people in the public engage with that properly. You might if you're working in a restaurant doing certain things. I love the more anecdotal side. You get a couple of things that work really well. You make connections in your head. And I think, again, it comes down a lot to that this opening up has to really be that sense of possibility infectiously spreading, as it were, through people. And I think that's what we've got a nice bit more of. On one of the last questions we have here is on a question, diversity and inclusivity. I mean, this brings in, a lot of factors. one element that I always find intriguing is, like, you look at the world of craft beer and the image, the custodians of it so often are cast as this sort of big bearded, bald headed sort of, faux biker kind of guy or whatever. Do you think that's a thing that cider, can avoid this sort of its own bubbles kind of like, setup or custodianship? It seems there's some good signals and signs in cider, if there's still a long, long way to go in terms of, cider hopefully not pigeonholing itself in that way. But what are your thoughts on
from a diversity point of view, from a production point of view, things are pretty monochrome, pretty white. Partly rooted in the fact that cider is almost exclusively a rurally produced drink rather than an herbist, and just the sheer sort of demographics provide the opportunity for things to be kind of skewed that way. Helen Ann Smith from Beer and Collective yesterday was talking about, from the 2011 census, the three counties area, Herefordshire, Gloucestershire and Worcestershire was 96.4% white. So, there are just some sort of factual elements kind of around that. With the growth of urban cideries and urban tap rooms and things like that, hopefully there will be that growth and there will be that change. So there's some fundamental elements there. In terms of diversity of people who aren't just a white man like me, the number of women who are working in the industry, it continues to grow. Women have always worked in the industry in very prominent roles as well, and very significant, fascinating, inspiring people too, certainly in my cider journey as well. And that's brightly being championed and upweighted with the likes of organizations such as Cider Women, a fantastic offshoot of the Pom Boots group in the USA. And then from the inclusivity point of view, I would like to think that cider is an inclusive, friendly, welcoming space. As you can see who I am and what I look like. I try to be aware, but I'm not necessarily the person who feels it kind of so rawly, because I get the opportunity to do it. There's no kind of problems. There are some sort of classic and fundamental things that need to be addressed, as all drinks do, in terms of providing safe and welcoming kind of places. And cider, certainly when it pertains to some of its more cultural elements around Morris men and wassailing and blacking up and things like this, these are questions that need to be talked about. Let's have an open discussion. Let's not get defensive. Let's not get emotive. Let's talk about this and let's understand and to learn.
That's the thing, isn't it? I know there's challenges for cider, but in its flux, you hope that then open ears can be the thing. The way I tend to end up feeling with a lot of areas of such issues is trying to be aware of what you don't know, basically, and engage with that. And I always remember, for example, before the virus arrived at Cloudwater's Family and Friends, watching a wonderful talk involving Lily White. And, when someone says something that's just so damn obvious, but in hindsight, as it were, and she was talking about, for example, just, say at a tap room, toilets just being unisex, you're not making that divide. That can make a world of difference to someone as far as it's something being accustomed, not putting someone in a slightly awkward position, perhaps, And I think that has got to be the thing, as you say, there's, things to be done, certainly, but open ears to experiences of their own is massively the starting point.
And, it's, this was in a great conversation with Helen and Ren yesterday around that cider has an opportunity to, but before the industry gets sort of extra sort of complex and goes really kind of big and there's lots of people, we have the opportunity as the participants now to set the tone and to ask the questions and to work things out so that we can set the parameters, we can set the trend, we can set, no, this is what's acceptable, and this is what we stand for, and this is not. And the Three Counties Cider and Perry Association's, statement of intent around equality, diversity, inclusion is amazing, and hopefully is indicative of cider's attitude.
Yeah. Well, perhaps as the last word, I don't know how this works in terms of closing up and cutting off. So that's what like to look at really important things like this now, the wonderful CraftCon, and thank you to all the organisers and wonderful, brilliant Simon Day for everything he's been doing with it. As you say, because those of us who've engaged with cider, the opportunity is now, but all of a sudden you can get the prospect other people be involved. Those who care you want it to, go through its next stages in the best possible kind of manner, in good ways, and that's the kind of that's why it's such a joy to have these kind of conversations going, so that hopefully we can, together help create that. So, absolutely. Well, happy writing, Gabe. How far are you?
Yeah, we're doing okay. Yep. I'll see you on the 1st of June, and probably not much before that. So yeah, plenty to do.
It's much easier, right?
It says, when is the book released? It's coming out in October. Can you pre-release? Yes, but not yet. We're still a few months ahead. There'll be lots of activity over the summer once it's all put together, and we've got some of the design and the illustration together. There's going to be some events and activities as well around it. If you're not a member of CAMRA, do sign up, because there's lots of benefits, including getting discounts on my course and all of the learning and discover pages for the book there. So yeah, all I can say is just keep drinking cider, keep championing cider, celebrating cider, be positive. There's room for everyone. Great opportunities, still a few challenges to go, but openness, honesty, and transparency is going to be the way. And we'll be doing this in person this time next year with 500 people turning up, I reckon.
Yeah. Well, on that one, I say we'll wrap on up and do. I can't wait to read it and see as all things are. And just say that'd be great to be able to do those things in person. So I've got a skedaddle. I'm off to do a staff training at Lyle's. So hopefully give me some food. That'd be great. So yeah.
Cheers, guys.
Thanks. To see you again, and hope to see you in person soon. And thank you, everybody. Stay safe.
Nice one. Cheers, Felix. And yeah, if anyone's got any questions or anything for me, you can always contact me via social media or email gabe@ciderologist.com. Always good to chat. Cheers.
Cheers, everyone. All right.